The paranoid tyrant, King Henry VIII's decaying body, and the wives who suffered his madness. The great hall of Hampton Court fell silent as the massive figure approached, each labored step accompanied by the sickening squelch of infected flesh against silk stockings. The year was 1546, and Henry VIII, once the Golden Prince of England, had become something far more terrifying than any medieval nightmare. Courtiers pressed themselves against tapestried walls, their perfumed handkerchiefs raised instinctively to block the putrid stench that preceded their king like a herald of decay. This was no longer the athletic youth who had once danced until dawn and jousted with legendary skill. The creature before them weighed nearly 400 pounds, his once handsome face now a bloated mask of suspicion and rage. Ulcers the size of dinner plates wept constantly through the silk bandages wrapped around his massive legs, leaving a trail of corruption in his wake. Yet it was not merely his physical deterioration that struck terror into every heart present. It was the madness that burned in his small, piggy eyes, a paranoid fury that had already consumed 2 wives and countless innocents. Behind him, in the shadows cast by flickering torches, moved the ghosts of his victims. Anne Boleyn, whose swan-like neck had been severed by a French swordsman's blade; Catherine Howard, barely 20 when she met her doom; and the living casualties, Catherine of Aragon, dying alone and abandoned, and Anne of Cleves, forever grateful for her narrow escape from matrimonial hell. Each woman had entered his orbit with hope, only to discover that marriage to Henry VIII meant entering a labyrinth of psychological torture from which few emerged unscathed. What transformed England's Renaissance prince into this paranoid tyrant? The answer lies not just in the corruption of absolute power, but in the literal decay of his body. A putrefying shell that housed a mind increasingly consumed by terror, rage, and an insatiable hunger for control that would ultimately devour everyone he claimed to love. Chapter 1. The King's Rotting Foundation. The transformation began with a single moment of catastrophic violence that would echo through the remaining decade of Henry's reign. On January 24, 1536, during a tournament at Greenwich Palace, the king's destrier, a massive warhorse bred for battle, stumbled beneath him. Henry, encased in nearly 80 pounds of steel armor, crashed to the frozen earth with the force of a falling oak. For 2 terrifying hours, the future of England hung in the balance as its king lay unconscious, his courtiers whispering prayers and calculating their survival odds should he die. But Henry survived, or so it seemed. What emerged from that tilting yard was fundamentally altered, though it would take years for the full horror to manifest. Modern medical experts examining historical accounts believe the impact caused severe traumatic brain injury, explaining the dramatic personality changes that followed. The jovial, if temperamental king began exhibiting signs of profound psychological damage, explosive rages that could last for hours, paranoid delusions that saw enemies in every shadow, and a growing cruelty that would make his court a living hell. Yet the psychological transformation was merely the prelude to physical horror. Within months of the accident, mysterious ulcers began appearing on Henry's legs, wounds that would never heal, growing larger and more putrid with each passing season. Court physicians, who dared not suggest their monarch was gravely ill for fear of treason charges, could only watch helplessly as the infections spread. The king's legs became grotesque cylinders of corrupted flesh, wrapped constantly in silk bandages that needed changing multiple times daily. The stench became legendary among those forced to attend him. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote privately of the most vile and noisome smell that emanated from the royal presence, noting that even hardened soldiers, men accustomed to battlefield carnage, would gag when approaching their sovereign. Servants drew lots to determine who would help dress the king, as proximity to those putrefying limbs was considered a form of punishment. The sweet perfumes and burning herbs that filled every room Henry occupied could not mask the overwhelming reek of decay that had become his permanent companion. Dr. John Caius, one of the period's most respected physicians, later recorded his observations of the king's condition with clinical horror. The ulcers, he noted, were not mere surface wounds, but deep caverns that seemed to tunnel into the very bone. Maggots were found regularly feeding in the corrupted tissue, a detail so disturbing that it was struck from official records. The king's own body was literally consuming itself, and with each passing day, his mental state deteriorated in direct proportion to his physical decay. By 1540, Henry required mechanical assistance merely to stand. A special chair equipped with pulleys and levers was constructed to lift his massive frame, operated by a team of 6 strong men who approached their task with the solemnity of pallbearers. The irony was not lost on perceptive courtiers. The man who claimed divine authority could no longer perform the basic human function of rising under his own power. Yet none dared voice such observations, for Henry's paranoia had reached levels that made survival at court a daily gamble with death. Chapter 2. The Surveillance State of a Madman. Hampton Court Palace, once a symbol of Renaissance splendor, had become a fortress of fear by 1545. Henry's paranoia had transformed every corridor into a potential death trap, every conversation into a possible conspiracy. The king's apartments were honeycombed with secret passages and spy holes, architectural modifications that turned his living spaces into an elaborate surveillance system designed to catch potential assassins or traitors. "Trust no one," Henry reportedly told Thomas Seymour during one of his increasingly rare moments of clarity. "Not your wife, not your brother, not your own reflection." These words, recorded by a hidden scribe positioned behind a specially constructed wall panel, revealed the depths of his psychological deterioration. The man who had once reveled in courtly society now saw enemies in every face, poison in every cup, and betrayal in every whispered word. The king's bedchamber had become a fortress within a fortress. Loaded crossbows were positioned at strategic points around the massive bed, their strings taut and ready for instant use. Beneath his pillows lay an array of daggers and a wheel-lock pistol, one of the first firearms to enter England, always primed and ready. But even these precautions weren't sufficient for Henry's fevered imagination. Armed guards were stationed inside the room itself, watching their monarch sleep with the vigilance of men guarding a powder keg. The surveillance network Henry constructed would have impressed modern police states. A complex hierarchy of spies watched courtiers, while other agents were assigned to watch the watchers. Nobody knew who was reporting to whom, creating a climate of such suspicion that normal conversation became virtually impossible. The Venetian ambassador, writing to his doge, described Henry's court as a place where men speak in riddles and trust is currency no one can afford to spend. Food tasting had evolved from a simple precaution into an elaborate ritual of paranoia. Not content with single tasters, Henry demanded that every dish be sampled by multiple servants, who then had to wait 30 minutes in his presence before he would touch a morsel. But even this wasn't sufficient. The king insisted on watching the preparation of his meals through hidden apertures, often spending hours observing kitchen staff who had no idea they were being scrutinized by their increasingly unstable monarch. The psychological toll on Henry's court was devastating. Sir Thomas Wyatt, the poet and courtier, wrote privately of sleepless nights and constant anxiety, describing court life as walking daily upon knives' edges, where a misplaced word or gesture might mean one's final dawn. Suicide rates among courtiers reached unprecedented levels, with several prominent nobles choosing self-inflicted death rather than enduring the psychological torture of Henry's presence. The king's paranoia had created a contagion of fear that infected everyone within the palace walls, transforming what should have been the apex of English society into a madhouse ruled by a decomposing tyrant who saw threats in every shadow and betrayal in every smile. Chapter 3. The Wives Who Walked Through Hell. The woman's scream echoed through the stone corridors of the Tower of London, a sound that would haunt the nightmares of every soul within hearing distance. It was May 17, 1536, and Anne Boleyn, once the most desired woman in England, was about to discover the true cost of marrying Henry VIII. But her agony had begun long before the executioner's blade would end her suffering. For weeks, Anne had been forced to watch as her alleged lovers were dragged to their deaths one by one. Her own brother, George Boleyn, had been among them, executed on fabricated charges of incest that even Henry's sycophantic courtiers found difficult to stomach. The psychological torture was deliberate and methodical. Henry didn't merely want Anne dead, he wanted her broken first, her spirit crushed beneath the weight of watching innocent men die because of their supposed association with her. The night before her execution, Anne's jailer reported finding her laughing hysterically in her cell, her mind finally snapping under the pressure. "I heard say the executioner was very good," she had babbled, running her hands repeatedly around her slender neck. "And I have a little neck." The woman who had once held the King of England in thrall was reduced to a gibbering wreck, her sanity scattered like leaves in a winter wind. But Anne's fate was merciful compared to what awaited Catherine Howard. A teenager when she married the increasingly monstrous Henry, Catherine's youth and beauty initially seemed to revive some spark of the man he had once been. For a brief, shining moment, courtiers dared to hope that marriage might cure their king's growing madness. They were catastrophically wrong. When Henry discovered Catherine's premarital relationships, affairs that any reasonable person would have considered the natural romantic experiences of a young woman, his rage transcended ordinary fury and entered realms of pure, focused evil. He didn't simply order her execution, he crafted a campaign of psychological destruction that would have impressed the most creative torturer. Catherine was stripped of her royal title and dignity, paraded through London in a common cart like a common criminal, forced to listen as criers proclaimed her sins to jeering crowds. The truly diabolical aspect of Henry's revenge was the law he passed specifically because of Catherine's case. The Treason Act of 1542 made it treasonous for any woman to marry the king without revealing her complete sexual history. It was petty vindictiveness, elevated to the level of national legislation, Henry's hurt feelings becoming the law of the land. Catherine, still a teenager, was told she would die because she had failed to inform her middle-aged husband about relationships she had experienced as a child. Catherine of Aragon's suffering was perhaps the cruelest of all because it was extended over years rather than ended with a quick death. Henry's first wife, the Spanish princess, who had loved him genuinely and faithfully for over 2 decades, was subjected to a slow-motion campaign of emotional destruction. She was exiled from court, forbidden from seeing her beloved daughter Mary, and forced to live in increasingly squalid conditions as Henry gradually stripped away her household and resources. The final insult came when Henry ordered his agents to remove Catherine's royal coat of arms from her residence and replace it with symbols marking her as a disgraced commoner. She died alone in a freezing castle, writing love letters to the man who had destroyed her life, letters that Henry never bothered to read. Some historians suspect she was poisoned, though Henry's systematic emotional torture may have been sufficient to kill her slowly. Anne of Cleves emerged as the sole survivor of Henry's matrimonial reign of terror, and her escape came through a combination of political acumen and sheer luck. When Henry decided their marriage needed to be annulled, Anne made the wisest decision of her life. She agreed immediately and enthusiastically. Her survival strategy was brilliant. She praised Henry's wisdom, thanked him for freeing her from an unwanted marriage, and expressed nothing but gratitude for his mercy. This response so confounded the paranoid king that he actually treated her with something approaching kindness, providing her with properties and a generous pension that allowed her to live comfortably for the rest of her days. Chapter 4. Gluttony as Performance Art. The Great Hall of Westminster Palace had been transformed into something resembling a Roman emperor's fever dream. It was Christmas Day, 1546, and Henry VIII was preparing to demonstrate that even in his final putrefying months, his appetites remained as monstrous as his body had become. What followed was not merely a meal, but a grotesque performance that would horrify witnesses and epitomize the sick spectacle his reign had become. The king, now so massive that 4 men were required to maneuver his specially constructed eating chair into position, surveyed the feast spread before him with the satisfaction of a conqueror viewing his spoils. The sheer scale of the display defied comprehension. Entire roasted swans, arranged in formation like an edible armada, peacocks stuffed with smaller birds in a carnivorous Russian doll arrangement, and a roasted boar so large it required its own table. This was not food, it was an obscene monument to excess built from the flesh of dead animals. But the true horror lay not in the quantity but in the ritualistic madness that surrounded Henry's eating. Each dish had to pass through an elaborate ceremony of tasting that had evolved into something resembling a religious service conducted by paranoid madmen. Multiple servants sampled every morsel, waiting precisely 30 minutes between tastings, while Henry watched with the intensity of a scientist observing a potentially lethal experiment. The slightest hesitation from a taster could result in immediate imprisonment on suspicion of attempted poisoning. "Bring me the swan," Henry commanded, his voice thick with phlegm and corruption. The massive bird, stuffed with herbs and smaller fowl, was presented on a golden platter that groaned under its weight. Henry's method of eating had become as disturbing as his appearance. Unable to lean forward due to his enormous bulk, he required servants to feed him pieces of meat while he sat motionless like some grotesque idol receiving offerings from his worshippers. The sounds emanating from the royal throat were described by the French ambassador as more suitable to a pig's feeding trough than a king's table. Henry's breathing had become so labored that each swallow was accompanied by wet, rattling gasps that echoed through the hall. Yet he continued consuming vast quantities with mechanical determination, as if eating had become less about sustenance than about demonstrating his power over the natural world. Dr. Thomas Linacre, the royal physician, watched this performance with growing horror. His private notes, discovered centuries later, describe Henry's eating habits as a form of slow suicide conducted before an audience of terrified witnesses. The king's belief in the magical properties of certain foods had reached levels of delusional thinking that bordered on the supernatural. He consumed massive quantities of oysters, believing they would restore his sexual potency, devoured entire deer haunches, convinced they would improve his hunting skills, and gorged himself on expensive spices imported from distant lands because he believed they would purify his rotting blood. The psychological impact on courtiers forced to witness these feeding spectacles was profound and lasting. Many developed eating disorders themselves, unable to consume food normally after watching their monarch's grotesque performances. Sir William Compton reported private nightmares filled with images of Henry's bloated face mastication endlessly, while the stench of his infected legs filled imaginary dining halls. Perhaps most disturbing was Henry's insistence that these meals were expressions of kingly magnificence rather than symptoms of profound illness. He would lecture his horrified audience about the divine right of kings to consume whatever they desired, seemingly oblivious to the fact that his magnificence had become a spectacle of decay that shocked even hardened courtiers accustomed to medieval brutality. The man who claimed to rule by God's grace had become a living argument against the divine nature of monarchy. His body, a rotting testimony to the consequences of unchecked power and appetites. Chapter 5. Death's Gruesome Victory. The stench hit visitors to Whitehall Palace like a physical blow, so overwhelming that even hardened soldiers retched openly in the corridors. It was January 1547, and Henry VIII was dying as grotesquely as he had lived, his massive body becoming a festival of corruption that defied both medical science and human endurance. The king's apartments had become a charnel house where the living were forced to attend the slow-motion decomposition of their monarch. Henry's legs, now grotesquely swollen to twice their normal size, leaked a constant stream of putrid fluid that soaked through multiple layers of silk bandages and pooled on the floor beneath his chair. The infections had progressed so severely that chunks of necrotic flesh literally fell from his body as he moved, leaving a trail of royal decay that servants followed with buckets and rags. The sight was so disturbing that several courtiers reportedly suffered complete mental breakdowns after witnessing the king's condition. "His Majesty's body rebels against his soul," whispered Dr. William Butts, the royal physician, in a confession he later recanted out of fear. But the observation was accurate. Henry's physical form was disintegrating faster than his mind could process the horror of his own mortality. The king, who had once believed in his divine invincibility, was confronting the ultimate limitation of earthly power, the rebellion of flesh against will. The dying process became a macabre theatre performance that lasted for weeks. Henry, unable to accept his mortality, continued attempting to conduct royal business from his bed of corruption. He would summon terrified courtiers to his bedside, conducting meetings while his body visibly deteriorated before their eyes. The sight of their once mighty king reduced to a writhing mass of infected flesh and desperate paranoia broke something fundamental in the English court's collective psyche. Dr. Owen, a Welsh physician brave enough to examine the king closely, left private notes describing wounds that tunneled to depths that seemed to reach his very bones, filled with corruption that defied all understanding of natural decay. The smell was so overwhelming that herbs and perfumes burned continuously in Henry's chambers, creating a sickly sweet miasma that somehow made the underlying stench even more nauseating. When death finally claimed Henry VIII on January 28, 1547, the relief among his attendants was palpable, but their ordeal was far from over. The king's body had become so corrupted during his final weeks that preparing it for burial presented unprecedented challenges. His corpse, swollen with gases from internal decay, required a specially reinforced lead-lined coffin that took craftsmen days to construct. The funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle became a nightmarish journey that none of its participants would ever forget. Despite the lead lining and multiple wooden shells, Henry's remains continued to deteriorate during transport. Witnesses reported hearing disturbing sounds from within the coffin, creaking, settling noises that suggested ongoing structural changes in the royal corpse. Then came the explosion. Somewhere along the road to Windsor, the accumulated gases from Henry's decomposing body reached critical pressure. The lead lining, designed to contain his remains for eternity, burst like an overripe fruit. The resulting mess was so horrific that several members of the funeral party fled the scene entirely, unable to continue their duties. Servants had to stop the procession for hours while they attempted to clean up the scattered remains of their former king with buckets and shovels. The burial itself became a final act of grotesque comedy. Henry's coffin was so heavy with reinforcements and decay that the grave had to be dug extra wide and deep. Even then, the ground kept collapsing under the weight, requiring multiple attempts before the royal remains could be successfully interred. Workers reported that the earth around the grave remained noticeably softer for months afterward, suggesting that decomposition continued long after burial. For years following Henry's death, visitors to St. George's Chapel reported strange odors and sounds emanating from the royal vault. Some claimed it was the ghost of the tyrannical king, but historians now believe it was simply the ongoing chemical process of his corruption, a final reminder that even death couldn't immediately end the chaos Henry VIII brought to everything he touched. Conclusion: the monster's legacy. In the end, Henry VIII achieved a form of immortality that no monarch could have desired, not as a great king remembered for wisdom or valor, but as a cautionary tale about the corruption that absolute power inflicts upon both body and soul. His physical decomposition became a perfect metaphor for the moral decay that transformed England's golden prince into a paranoid tyrant whose very presence terrorized a kingdom. The wives who survived his matrimonial reign of terror carried scars that extended far beyond their individual sufferings. They became symbols of feminine resilience in the face of institutional brutality, women who endured psychological tortures that would have broken lesser spirits. Their stories remind us that behind every tyrant's public cruelties lie countless private agonies inflicted upon those who made the mistake of trusting in the promises of power. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that Henry's transformation was not sudden, but gradual, a slow corruption that his courtiers enabled through their silence and complicity. The paranoid surveillance state he created, the psychological torture he inflicted on his wives, and the grotesque spectacle of his final years all developed because no one possessed the courage to confront a king whose power had become absolute. In seeking to avoid the tyrant's wrath, they enabled the monster's growth until he consumed everything he touched. The putrefying corpse that exploded during his funeral procession serves as the perfect final image of Henry VIII's reign. A corruption so profound that even death could not contain it, a toxicity that continued to spread chaos long after the man himself was gone. History remembers him not for the greatness he claimed, but for the horror he embodied. A king whose legacy is written in the graves of his victims and the nightmares of those who survived his tyranny. Tentar novamente, o Claude, pode cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas.